Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
That looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
For something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Hate crimes and hate groups have increased sharply since the year 2000. Although hatred is often described as an emotion, psychologists assert it's actually a learned behavior, a behavior that damages those that hate as much as those who are the subject of that hate. In this edition of Challenge 2.0, faith leaders from Christianity, Judaism, and Islam examine the costly culture of contempt in the U.S. and possible ways to break the cycle that feeds it. So this is a topic that we have talked about for years, and unfortunately we're probably going to continue to talk about hate and the various aspects of it. And we have three wonderful guests that we're going to mine their wisdoms, their perspectives on this. So I'd like to introduce Pastor Dave Brown and Imam Jamal Rahman and Rabbi Olivier Ben Chaim. And I thank each of you for joining us. We've been doing this for a number of years, and each time, I know for me, is a treat. So thank you, each of you, for agreeing to join us on this conversation.
Thank you.
We look at our topic, and when we think about hatred and how it's expressed today, what examples pop into your mind initially?
Well, for me, it's very much alive and hitting my newsfeed every day, and it's the anti-Jewish hatred that we're unfortunately seeing on the streets of most of our Western cities, and it's a great concern. We'll see how things unfold. But for me, it's top of my list right now, of course.
Jamal?
Absolutely. That's very critical. And also critical is, this terrible polarization between the parties.
Mm-hmm.
This adversarial stance each party has, whether it's Republican or Democrat. And this really blurs, I would say, our ethics in our thinking, in our behavior, in our action.
Mm-hmm.
And this reminds me of a wonderful quote from the Quran that says, when there is chronic anger, fear, hate, it's not that the eyes become blind, the hearts become blind.
Mm-hmm.
And when the hearts become blind, we're capable of doing the most terrible things in every possible way. So that to me is a great danger.
And we see that. Dave, how about
I
you?
think in the dehumanization of those we disagree with. When we see at the highest office of the land, when somebody dies, instead of having empathy for that life and for the loved ones, you call them names and make them less than human. When Renee Good and Alex Petty were killed in the streets of Minneapolis, rather than all of us sharing the loss of humanity that you would think nobody would want to see happen,
Mm-hmm.
there's no sense of that empathy or that sense of identifying with the grief that people are feeling. So there seems to be, to build on what Brother Jamal said, the dehumanization of our opponents. They become objects,
Mm-hmm.
Objects of our hate, and then there's a whole people. And what's happening with anti-Semitism right now. So I think it's really everywhere, and my last comment is on both sides of the aisle. And all of that, I think, is really, really a very dangerous thing.
In the introduction to this program, we quoted some research from psychologists that said we aren't born with this capacity to hate, that it's something we learn. And I guess my question to each of you, from your observations, from your work, where do we learn this from and why?
We might learn it from, in the early ages from our parents.
Mm-hmm.
We might learn it from our school teachers. We might learn it from the people around us. But we also, obviously nowadays, it's more permeating our lives in the guise of our cell phones and all the propaganda apps that our children and all of us really have on our at our fingertips, and hatred sells, whipping up people's emotions, keeps them engaged, keeps them, which is what the industry wants, to keep your eyes on their platform, on their app. And hatred is a very potent modality to keep people engaged and to keep people enraged. So it's everywhere, and it's becoming increasingly impossible to counter, because we're faced with a multi-billion-dollar industry whose aim is to keep us emotionally whipped out against each other, because again, it's for profit, which is really dangerous.
We certainly see that with social media. Looking at in the classroom or in families or parents, why do both of you think that is something that is taught? Perhaps not consciously, but that's taught nonetheless.
I certainly learned in my suburban New Jersey home in the 50s. They wouldn't have called it hate, but they would say the people of color and Jewish people were beneath us and somehow less than human. And language was used for those groups at gatherings that reinforced that. And there was a sense that it, as a young person trying to find my way, jumping in with that gave me an identity. And I do think that there are certain identities built around hatred for certain groups. And if you don't know who you are, if you're feeling anxiety about your identity, you become part of a circle that has named a certain group as less than human and worthy of your hate. And I do think that identity crisis drives some people into those groups. And I think that's real.
Yeah, I would say, it's the environment, as both of you have mentioned. Our teachers, our religious leaders, our politicians, the media, they all have their conditioned biases. And that affects me and creates my conditioning of bias also that can lead to hate. But I want to point to one more aspect of this hate. Sometimes hate can happen, in fact quite often, from unresolved. It could be righteous anger, righteous fear, righteous sadness, quote unquote. But if I don't resolve that, if I don't acknowledge, I don't heal and reframe that, I need a distraction. And sometimes the very easy distraction is hate. So that is a very important point to also, I would say, to consider.
So we don't transform it. What we're experiencing, we transmit it to somebody.
Because we have to do the inner inconvenient work of confronting our biases, our conditioning, my anger. And I said it could be righteous, my child has been killed, or there's been injustice, there's been oppression. But if I don't, for example, manage my anger, and that requires a lot of work,
right?
Then it becomes easy to have that fester into just hate. That's much easier. And that's a distraction from me doing what is called the inner inconvenient work of acknowledging, healing, and transforming my pain, you might say.
And I think in a growing secular society as well, we no longer see something unique or sacred in all human beings. We see people simply as their identity as a product of their actions or their choices. So those who do hateful things, that becomes who they are. We don't really separate that divine spirit in somebody from a hurtful or hateful action.
If I look back toward my childhood, and that was a very long time ago, but I think of the cartoons that I used to watch, and if they were talking about hatred, it would often be pictured as one character shooting like little daggers toward the object of that hate. But is it really one direction? Or is the hatred damaging both to the person that is the object of that hate, but also the person who's expressing it?
There's a teaching in our tradition, in Jewish tradition, related actually to bad-mouthing, to saying evil things about someone, is that it hurts the person that you're speaking about. as you saying evil things about them, and it could be words of hatred, in fact. But it also hurts the person that is speaking the words themselves, because there's a psychological damage that is caused by that, having that perspective on the world or on someone else, and all the projections and all the unacknowledged shadow that is voiced in words of hatred. But they said there's a third person that is also hurt, is the person that hears it. So there's the person that is witnessing what is also happening in the interaction between two people, and that also hurts them. It hurts them in their perspective on the two people they are looking at throwing daggers at each other. So actually it hurts three people, three parties.
Perhaps lowering the threshold and doing some of the teaching that we were talking about, that it's learned.
Yes. The Quran has a very wonderful insight, I feel. The Quran says when there is chronic anger, fear, and hatred, it creates a rust on the heart. And when there's a rust on the heart, it separates us, takes us away from the divine light, as it were. We become separated from divinity. And that, the sages say, is one of the hardest burdens to bear. In fact, there's a wonderful Hafiz poem, that 14th century Persian poet, Hafiz, who says, to this person who is filled with hate, whose heart is become rusted because of the hate and fear and anger, he says, let me bring you some food, a tray of food, some drink, a soft cushion for your head, because being separated from the light is one of the hardest burdens to bear. And as far as the person who's on the receiving end of the hate, that fear that they feel, that insecurity that they feel, the sadness that they feel, it's such a burden on them. So, I love that Islamic Sufi story of a Sufi master who knew the language of animals, who asked a camel, which is harder, uphill or downhill? And the camel replied, oh, you silly Sufi, it's not the uphill or downhill, it's the burden I carry. The burden of that fear I'm feeling because of somebody's hate, the insecurity, the sadness that I'm feeling. That affects me deeply.
I wish I knew the source of the simple little kind of quote that hating somebody is like drinking poison and expecting that your enemy is going to die. And when I was, I believe from my interfaith work that the core teaching of Jesus is radical unconditional love. And when he says love your enemy in Matthew's gospel, I don't think he's just thinking about the enemy. I think he realizes that his disciples, who he's teaching really on their spiritual path, trying to live his way in the world, have to let go of that hate and find a way of love and caring for the well-being of those that oppress them. And I think it's really important when we think of loving our enemy and not hating them, that it doesn't mean, I think it was Frederick Buechner who wrote about this, that doesn't necessarily mean liking your enemy. Loving is not an emotion, but it's an intention. It's you care about everybody's well-being and recognize everybody's humanity. You may not like them, but you care about their well-being. But then Buechner puts the jab and says, but if you care about somebody's well-being enough, you may end up finding a way of liking them too.
I think there is a step actually before being able to love someone who has hurt you or someone who has hatred towards you, who has shown, who are displayed in their actions that hatred towards you. There is a step that comes before, which is forgiveness. I think before we can move to love, I think we have to start with forgiveness first, and that's a process in and of itself. It's a process of acknowledging what has happened and making it real, because forgiveness is not, just forgetting, or it's not just, oh, I forgive you, therefore it never happened. No, it really happened, right? The next step is to, after we've acknowledged, is to realize that what had happened could not have been any different than it was, and letting go of our need for what was to be any different than it was, recognizing that people act in ways that are an expression of their conditioning, oftentimes the circumstances of their lives. I mean, just trying to get some more meat around why was the person behaving this way?
Mm-hmm.
What was their psychology in the moment? Whatever information we can get to us to a place of understanding that what was, and letting go of our need for what was to have been different than it was. That's really the key, to let go of our need for what was to have been any different than it was. And when we move into that step, then we might be able to forgive, which is the third step, which I think gets us to the place of love.
And what I'm hearing you say, and I want to make sure I'm hearing you say it, that forgiveness becomes your inner spiritual work.
Correct.
And is not contingent on the individual saying, I'm sorry, or seeking reconciliation.
Absolutely.
So it is our spiritual journey to get to a place to forgive so that we can love in the way that the great spiritual teachers tell us to, not to say, I'll forgive you when you come over and say, I'm sorry.
Correct.
And also when you forgive, like for example, Nelson Mandela, when he was in prison,
Right.
and he was released, and he said, if I don't forgive and overcome my hate and anger towards the other, I'll still be in prison. So the point is, if I forgive, this is another very important point about forgiving, I have to also simultaneously take care of that wound that has been inflicted upon me. If I don't take care of the wound, I just say, I forgive you, that famous saying, it's like then whitewashing a burning house. I have not taken care of the wound. That's not authentic forgiveness, and I'm not healed, nor am I causing healing, unless I also take care of that pain that is deep within me. And that's deep spiritual work.
Deep spiritual work that I think ultimately leads, one of my favorite teachers, Rabbi Rami Shapiro, writes, he's got a wonderful little book about forgiveness, and he says eventually at the end of the book, he says, once we do this profound spiritual work of forgiveness is no longer something we do, it becomes something we are.
We are. How can people move on? And you've suggested that already, but what are some other ways that people can move on from what might be called an addiction to hate?
I think that's a really hard piece, because it means when you let go of something, to embrace something different or to live into something different, you do have a period of uncertainty as you do that. And I think it's really hard. You can't do that without community walking with you. It wasn't hatred, but I moved from a very judgmental, harsh evangelical Christianity into a more inclusive Christianity when people embraced me on that journey, because it was hard to let go of what told me who I was. And it was lonely until I found some fellow travelers.
That wonderful saying by the Buddha, which I love very much. The Buddha, he said, hate never yet dispelled hate. Only love dispels hate. But the question is, how do you create this environment of love? You mentioned community. That's very critical. If one has the right community or can create for that person who spews hate, a community where they really are willing to listen to this person. Because underneath that pain, as you were indicating, underneath his hate is that pain that person has experienced, no matter what the wound is inside. So to listen to a person who is hateful, who's spewing hate, is a wonderful therapy without interjecting, just truly listening, and that requires really a wonderful community to be able to do that. And of course, there are lots of spiritual practices. We mentioned silence. There is a program of practice of, with compassion, with love, facing the energy of hate, and just being with that. I would just conclude by saying, like Carl Jung, I always quote him in this program here, when he said, would you once have the courage and the grace to kiss the demons and dragons within you? That is how they turn into a prince or princess. But how do you do that? Those are spiritual practices. In Islam, there's a practice called sacred holding. that just allows you with compassion to be with your pain, to acknowledge it, to heal it, and to transform it. It's a powerful energy. If I can reframe it, my deep anger can turn into an inner enthusiasm, a vigor. My fear into a greater mindfulness. My sadness into greater empathy. So yes, community and spiritual practices can really help.
The other part of hatred is that it's empowering. Like there's an energy in hatred that is empowering. And most of the time, oftentimes, people that feel disempowered fall into hatred in order to regain some sense of power over parts of their life, over someone else, whatever the case may be. I think it's there is something in the psychology of hatred that happens in group setting. It's there is something about hating another group allows your group to feel superior to the others, and we see that in racism between minorities, where you always try to be hateful of another minority so that they can be at the bottom of the totem pole, and you feel uplifted by that. You're not as bad as them.
I may not be at the top, but I'm above you.
Exactly. So there's power in that, and there is a. To me, I mean, all of what my friends have said here is definitely a part of it. And I'm going to quote a dear other friend of mine who said that peace will come when we invite each other for dinner in our homes. And I think there is something really powerful in meeting each other, of knowing each other, of encountering each other, and in finding the humanity. Because most often when we hate someone, we've made a caricature of them. We have an image of them in our minds that is the image that we hate.
Right.
And if we can be in a meeting, face to face, human to human, soul to soul with someone, that usually dissolves because we see the humanity in each other. So the encountering the in-person meeting, which is more and more difficult these days, I think can heal and alleviate.
So the key, and psychologists mention this, that they've said the key is not to disagree less, but to disagree better.
Yes.
Any closing thoughts on how you can do that?
This is something which comes up in our community always because, reproaching, how do we do that? Because I'm angry, even though I'm talking to the other person. So the Quran has a wonderful insight. Number one, it says, lower your voice when you're talking to the person with whom you have a problem. Lower your voice. And Rumi has a wonderful quote. Yes, please lower your voice because it is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. And then there's a wonderful Sufi master, Al-Ghazali, who says, please know that the tone of your voice can be more important than the content of what you're saying. So if you're angry, change the tone of your voice because that is critical. So lower your voice and be mindful of the tone of your voice as you're doing this a dialogue of reproaching, as you said.
And I think to be honest about your limits and your inner healing, and I'll be vulnerable, there are folks that I don't engage with because on some very precious issues we disagree and I'm not ready to completely I have hurt and anger. And so I'm not going to step into that until I have dealt with that anger and I can listen, stand up for a different point of view, but do it with respect and with love. And if I'm not able to do that with respect and love, I won't engage the person that I'm disagreeing with until I am grounded and centered when I do it.
I think there are forms of disagreement that are fundamental and so extreme that there may not be a possibility to find any common ground. So there are people that we know must continue to disagree with, and it is maybe our job to find those we can disagree better with.
Right.
And when we find these people who have not completely gone the very radical way, I always, one of the great principles of Jewish tradition is arguing. We argue over everything. We argue over text. In fact, our schools are made so that we put two people together, two students together, and they must disagree about a text and vehemently argue with each other. And each of them would have to bring, all their resources and their knowledge to make the point that they want to make about whatever the verse in the Torah was. And we do this, the basic for this is that we do this Leshem Shamayim. It's a very powerful principle in our tradition. Leshem Shamayim means for the sake of heaven. And so if you can find someone who is willing and able to do and argue with you and disagree with you Leshem Shamayim for the sake of heaven, so that both of you can be elevated instead of crushed, then there is a place for growth, and there is a place of meeting.
Like the Sages say, do what is right. Protect yourself. Don't allow yourself to be abused. But as you take the right action, I beg you, I implore you, the Sages say, they insist, don't keep that person's essence, that their divine spark, out of your heart. That is discipline, that is practice, requires me to evolve as a human being into my highest self.
And so I thank each of you for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom, giving us some guidelines for how we can engage more constructively in the environment we find ourselves. So thank you so much. We hope you'll tune in to our next episode of Challenge 2.0, where we're going to benefit from the thoughts and wisdom of all three of these faith leaders all over again. So thank you very much. We hope to see you next week.